The story of Christmas begins, as you heard in our reading this morning, with Mary, a teenage girl from a little village in Galilee in northern Israel who becomes pregnant. I think in the Protestant side of the church, people don't pay enough attention to Mary, actually. And of course, there's a reason for that. It's because they think that on the Catholic side of the church, too much has been made of Mary, to the point that she's been elevated and that people pray to her and revere her in a way that people think, well, that should only really be for God. But I think this reaction of not paying any attention to Mary causes us to downplay parts of the story in which she is so central, and as a result, maybe we miss some things. That's why I'm grateful for that time years ago when Linda began to build the Stations of the Cross each Lenten Easter season for us to walk through. Because when you get to the second to last station, always right back here on this section of wall back here, when you get to the second to last station, it's a painting of Mary with the lifeless body of Jesus draped across her lap. And her eyes are also lifeless. Her eyes are dead because the whole painting just shouts to you that Mary must have been thinking, has it come to this? Is this it? Is this where it ends? Because she has lived with her son this unusual and amazing story, which has now simply come crashing to an end with his public execution. But here we are as we begin our journey to Christmas at the beginning of that story. In fact, so much at the beginning that no one except those immediately around Mary even know what's happening at this point in the story. And nothing about the way the story begins is easy or comfortable. And although Mary's been told by the angel that her son will be called the Son of the Highest and will be given the throne of his father David and will reign over the house of Jacob forever, she's been told nothing, absolutely nothing about the road immediately ahead of her or what that is going to involve. And she's been given zero advice by the angel about how to navigate whatever's coming. Ever think about that? She's like, the angel says, so this is the deal. You know, you're going to be, full with child. It's going to be from the Lord. And this is who your son is going to be. And that's it. That's the beginning of the Christmas story. And so this week I've been reading a whole number of scholarly articles about Mary, the ancient peasant girl, and what she would have been like, what her life would have been like, and I've been trying to imagine her journey, which is probably odd for a 60-year-old man in 2021 to be trying to imagine the journey of a peasant girl in this situation. But it made me curious as I started trying to do that, like trying to imagine Mary's journey. It made me curious, and I started wondering, I wonder what other people, like the people in our church community, what do they think about when they think about Mary? What is it that comes to their mind? And so I thought it'd be interesting to just ask you this morning, what do you think about when you think about Mary as a young girl, as the one chosen by God about this journey? You probably know enough of the story in the Gospels to know something about the journey that ends up being required for. What thoughts go through your mind? I'm just kind of curious. What do you think? I'm really asking. Bravery. Yeah, a lot of courage. Being afraid, right? Right, and the problem with reading these stories in the Bible, Simi, to that point of being very afraid, is that we read them in the Bible and we encumber them, we lay onto them our religious tones. The angel comes, this is what's going to happen, we know the story, Mary says, let it be to me according to your word. We say, oh, that's awesome. And we're not thinking like, after that whole interchange was over, she's thinking, what? What else do you think of when you think of Mary? Faithful. Gosh, talk about faithful, right? Would we? Seems what? It seems crazy. Right, try telling that story to somebody. Try telling that story to your best friend. Hey, a kind of a quirky thing happened last night. Because keep in mind, in ancient Israel, nobody has said this is the moment, right? Everybody's wishing the moment of Messiah would come, but the days are just going by, week in, week out, normal weeks, right? And then, on the day God chooses, it happens. Crazy. Oh, that thing everybody's waiting for? It's starting with me, really. You know?
Well, I think
It was the end of any normal life for her. There's a spiritual analogy in that, but we won't quite go there yet for us. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Yes, I think she did. I don't know if she felt shame, but I'm pretty sure she was shamed by others. So we typically have heard that Mary was quite young, a teenager. But as I was reading this week, I learned a little more about this in Hebrew culture, that a little background I didn't understand. The point at which a girl got her period, because it meant she could bear children, was the moment she was considered to be of marriageable age. And that was usually around 12 years old. However, Hebrew culture was very aware of the fact that at that moment, a girl's body was not fully developed. And you've probably heard the stories about how there were these long betrothals, right? And the betrothals were more than what we call an engagement. Because an engagement's kind of like, yeah, we're going to do it, but we haven't done it yet. But a betrothal was like, no, we have. It's just as firm as a marriage commitment, but we haven't had the big party, we're not living in the same house, and we're not being intimate. So it's different from what we think of as an engagement. And that long confused me. What this betrothal thing? Is this just a cultural thing? Is it a slight difference? What is it? But the reason for it is that her family wanted to make a good match. That's what it's called when you talk about arranged marriage. A good match. Want to make a good match as soon as possible, especially when you live in a town like Nazareth with only 400 or 500 people. So not a lot of men to pick from. So the family would look to make a marriage match as soon as she began menstruating, but because she was still developing, it was necessary to wait. So there could be a year or two of betrothal. And if you haven't guessed, it was an arranged marriage, and that seems so foreign to us. Linda and I were watching an Indian film last night that was about a young couple in modern times with an arranged marriage. And it strikes us as so, like in Western culture, we have long said, arranged marriage, that's ridiculous. People, we're independent, self-made people. We, by the time we're 10, we should be making our own choices in life. And, and so we've really kind of dismissed that. But really, it's just another way. It's just another way. I love that scene, if you ever saw the movie When Harry Met Sally. Throughout the film, they interview these older couples. And there's one that's an Asian couple, and and it was an arranged marriage. And so they've been married, like 60 years, and the guy's telling the story of their marriage. And he says, that his parents went and they picked out this girl. And he says, so I snuck over to her village, and I hide behind a tree, and I see her, and I think she looked very good to me, So it's a different way, but when I look at where our culture is now, and I see the way that we have managed to divorce sexuality from profound love, and how sex has often become the first thing rather than a profound thing to be part of a special and a sacred love, it makes me have a great respect for the idea of saying these things are sacred and they are held at bay until the right time. And that's one thing that arranged marriage actually does. So we've sort of said, we don't need the arranged marriage, that's stupid. But then you look at our culture now and you say, we kind of slid way down the hill, didn't we? And I think we did. By the way, we often hear that Joseph was an older man. And the reason people speculate this is simply because when you get into the later parts of the Gospels and the book of Acts, he's never mentioned again. And so the assumption many people have made is, well, Joseph must have been older and he died. I don't know why he couldn't have been younger and he died, but everybody thinks, well, he must have been older and he died, and so that's why. But a lot of my reading this week suggested that was unlikely, that one of the values a family would have in looking for a match for their daughter would be to pick a young man, able-bodied, hardworking, and with a trade. And to me, this actually, if that is the case, actually makes the picture of Joseph kind of more interesting, because when you're older, you've been through your share of battles in life, and hopefully you know who you are, and you start to care less what people think of you. I mean, I've noticed that in my own life in the last 10 years. I'm in more of a sense of who Fran Lehman is, and some people like you and some people you don't. You kind of learn to live with that as you get older. But when you are a young man, you're more insecure, you're trying to prove yourself, and if you screw up, the older crowd around you is watching you to figure out if you know what you're doing. And now, your girl is pregnant, and you are supposed to respect her developing body enough to wait, and you were supposed to respect her parents enough to wait, and you live in a really small town. I think of the pressures that I felt in my 20s, trying to prove myself in my work, trying to show my in-laws, who I had managed to displease early on, that I really was a good choice of a husband. And I remember feeling those pressures in my life. And if Joseph was indeed a young man already behind the 8 ball because he had to prove himself, because he needed to do that, and now there's all of this and everybody's looking at him and they're thinking, oh, he's another screw-up kid. Now put on top of that for Joseph that she really is pregnant. Not just something people are saying. She really is pregnant. Everyone is bad-mouthing you, and you know it was some other guy. So put all that into Joseph's recipe. Try to figure out how. Everybody's looking at you saying, you did this thing, it's bad. You're thinking, I know I didn't do this thing. Somebody did this thing. She did this thing. Not too much pressure there. Is it really surprising that the Gospels say that Joseph's thought was to, quote, break it off quietly? And what about the hurt? My guess is that Mary was cute and Joseph was smitten. And then she does this. One of the descriptions of Mary I loved that I read this week was this. Listen. Mary was the future mother of Jesus of Nazareth. She was a young peasant girl, probably less than 5 feet tall, with glossy black hair, oiled and parted in the center parting being painted with red or purple dye. Her teeth would have been good, maybe better than ours, since the only sweeteners she would ever get came from dried fruit. There were heavy gold earrings swinging from her earlobes. You like that, ladies? An important part of her dowry. The earrings were part of the dowry, and so if you wanted everybody, if you were a dad and a mom and you wanted everybody to know that your girl had a dowry, you made sure that part of that dowry, part of that gold, was hanging off of her ears when she went out, so people say, oh, she's available, and Dad's got enough to hang those things on her ears. These were an important part of her dowry, so they would be as flashy as her family could manage. I love that. There might be a gold nose ring as well, though you're unlikely to see this on any statue of the Virgin Mary. A Jewish peasant girl needed to make an impact with the way she looked. Lumps of gold at her ears showed she was a respectable girl from a decent, established family. Now, those of you who have been to Haiti with us, you've already seen what kind of house Mary would have grown up in. If you've been to Haiti with us, you know this description. 2 rooms, a public room in the front, and a bedroom, a private room in the back. You walk in, that's the space where if someone comes into your home and you have them sit and you talk, and then there's a back room which has, the mats and the places to lay clothes and all of those kinds of things, and the kitchen, usually an outdoor kitchen, separate. There was no such thing, and there would be 8 to 10 people living in that house of 400 to 600 square feet, just as there usually are in those houses in Haiti that we go into. There was no such thing at that time and in that part of the world as the nuclear family where just mom, dad, and the kids lived in the house. There could be aunts, uncles, cousins, grandchildren. Galilee was the breadbasket of Israel, so there were orchards and vineyards and grain fields, and you needed a whole extended family to to work that. Those of you who have been to Haiti with us, you know how people often live in the village, but then they work a piece of land that's separate from their home, either across the river or on the next mountain, and it might be their land, or they might be sharecropping it for someone else. How many times in Haiti I have said to someone, you go across the across the river to work a garden, and they say, yes, and I say, no, is that your property? And they say, no, it's not my property. So how does that arrangement work? And they say, well, if I work the property, then I get some of what it yields. So it would have been exactly the same around Nazareth, and it's likely that Mary had calloused hands from hard work, and that by 7 or 8 years old, she knew what it was to work 12-hour days during harvest season in the orchard or the vineyard or the fields. And there would have been no way to keep a pregnancy secret. These days, we hear about girls or women keeping pregnancies secret for months and months and months. She lives in a 2-room house with a bunch of other women who, when they do the laundry, know if you are getting your period or not, if you catch my drift. So her family knows, and they immediately begin navigating the shame, the anger at Joseph or whoever. And can you picture the conversation where Mary tells them the story of the events in our scripture reading this morning? So this angel came to me. Yes, I'm pregnant. But this angel came to me. She's either telling the truth, or this is the worst lie she has ever told us to cover up her sin and her disgrace, which has now become our sin and our disgrace. So this is Mary, asked by God to take an extremely unique journey that no one else has ever taken. At the center of Christmas is what we call the incarnation. It's a word that literally means enfleshment. God decided to come into the world as one of us, not appearing as a full-grown human being showing up in some sort of, superhero, fully developed and fully powerful kind of way, but entering the full human experience, all its frailty, all its weakness, which meant being born into the world, and Mary is the young woman through whom he chooses to make this entrance. The Christian church has so many statues and images of Mary from across the centuries, and almost all of them are of Mary as a fully grown older woman. And almost all of them, because we make statues and images in order to help us revere people, in order to help us revere Mary, almost all of them have kind of a heavily religious feel. But this is Mary, the girl. Just a peasant girl, approached by an angel, asked to take a journey that's going to stretch her to her limits. It's going to stretch her to her limits at 13 years old, and at perhaps 46 years old, when she watches her friends lower Jesus' lifeless body down off the cross. My Advent and Christmas sermon series this year is called I Have This Hope, and each week my message will in some way be tied to one of those beloved Christmas songs that we sing. The song Come Thou Long Expected Jesus was written in 1744 by Charles Wesley, one of the Wesley brothers who founded what we call Methodism, as in the Methodist Church in England. And he wrote this song, Charles Wesley wrote this song as he looked at the plight of England's poor orphans and as he considered the class divide that existed in England at the time and how the poor seemed not really to care about, how the rich seemed not really to care about helping the poor. And you probably would recognize at least the first verse of this song, which goes something like this. Come thou long expected Jesus, born to set thy people free. From our fears and sins release us. Let us find our rest in thee. Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art. dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart. The song pays homage to the fact that indeed the people of Israel, Mary's people, had been waiting expectantly for a long time. Come, thou long expected Jesus. There's been talk and prophecies of a Messiah for at least hundreds of years by the time this happens in Mary's life. For at least hundreds of years. There's been lots of talk across Jewish culture of and prophecies about a coming Messiah. And so there was this sense of the people waiting for a great deliverance, for freedom, and that the Messiah would come and he would bring this. Come, thou long expected Jesus. But I called my sermon today, Come, thou long unexpected Jesus. I would say that it is virtually guaranteed that Mary's picture of what the Messiah, who is now her son, would be like and what he would do was very much the same as the broader religious and cultural picture. She grew up in a Jewish family. She grew up going to Jewish synagogue. What people thought about these things was probably what her family thought about these things. It was probably what she thought about these things. So she probably thought that when Messiah came, who is now coming through her, that he would be for us and against the Gentiles, because God, the true God, is the God of our tribe. She probably thought that he will militarily defeat the Romans. She probably thought he will make Israel the center of the world of nations, the greatest of nations, and the kings of the earth will come and bow down to our king, which I guess we could say prophetically will someday be true. On that afternoon of the resurrection, you hear it in the conversation between the disciples on the road to Emmaus and Jesus, whom you remember they don't recognize. When those disciples say to Jesus, and we had thought, right? Their faces are downcast. And we had thought that he was the one who would redeem Israel. Not so sure anymore. And we see it in that painting, in Mary's lifeless gaze. How can this be the end of the story? If he's going to take care of the Gentiles, and he's going to wipe out the Romans, and he's going to put us on the top of the world, how can this be the end of the story? And I want to suggest to you today, as we step into the season of Advent in the year of our Lord 2021, that the community of Jesus in our culture, maybe in the world, is still not so comfortable with the unexpected Jesus. We prefer the Jesus who is what we want him to be, what we feel we need him to be. Culturally, we want a Jesus who is for us and against the people that we are against. I mean, if we haven't seen that, if we don't think that's true, we haven't been paying attention the last few years in American culture, to the church in America. Personally, we prefer a Jesus who places a higher premium on our comfort and our immediate happiness than on reshaping our hearts and our thinking and who we are as human beings, right? I know what life's supposed to be like, Lord, and you're going to get me there, right? It's like, right? Like, sign here, Lord. I wrote it down. I know what life's supposed to be like and how it's all supposed to work out. So, sign there and tell me that that's what you're going to do. I think of Jesus in Luke 4, standing in that synagogue in Nazareth, in his hometown. I don't know if you remember that story, and reading from the scroll of Isaiah chapter 61. His hometown, his family's there, right? It's a small town. The whole town is there. The whole town is Jewish. Everybody's there. And everyone knows this passage from Isaiah 61. Isaiah 61 was like John 3:16 is for people today. Everybody knows this passage. And the passage ends with God's destruction of the Gentiles. It's the passage that starts out, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And he sent me to, bind up the brokenhearted, right? And Jesus gets to the end of the passage about, this is the acceptable year of the Lord. And the last verse of the passage, as it was traditionally read, is about the destruction of Gentiles. And Jesus rolls up the scroll, hands it back to the attendant, and he sits down. And then you could paraphrase what he says after that in his conversation with the people in the synagogue. You could probably paraphrase it all into this phrase. Jesus saying to them, not what you were expecting? No, we were expecting you to wrap it up the way it's supposed to wrap up, with the destruction of the Gentiles. But Jesus doesn't read that part. And then he goes on in that conversation to tell them that, actually, I can think of a few Gentiles who have had way more faith than you guys have, and who have, loved God, loved people, lived the life, been better people, And that's the part where they say, okay, let's throw them off the cliff. And I think of the cross. It's interesting, the cross, right? Like, the cross is the moment in the story. I know, it's Christmas, and that's Good Friday, and on our calendar, they're 4 months apart, but the cross is the moment where it seems sure that it's all gone bad. It seems like it's going bad when Judas is preparing to betray Jesus. It's definitely going bad in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Where they're they're coming out to arrest Jesus, and Peter's like, we're going to put up a defense, and he gets out the sword and starts whacking at people, and Jesus says, put away the sword. It was to live by the sword, die by the sword. It's not the way it's going to go down. He holds out his hands. They put the handcuffs on. They lead him back, and they say, the thing's definitely going bad. And then when we get to the cross, it has gone bad. And it takes a while among the early Christians. I have so many questions about this. The better I understand the gospel, the theology of death and resurrection, right? I have so many questions about this. I want to get to heaven or eternity or New Jerusalem or forever life on earth or whatever it's going to look like, and I want to get, especially Peter and Paul, maybe some of the other guys, together. And I do, and I know it sounds silly, and I want to say, so what was the process like? Because cross happens, right? Then the resurrection happens, so now there's hope. But what does the cross mean? What does it mean? And somewhere between the resurrection of Jesus and Paul's first letters, there's a lot of rethinking going on, right? I don't know if you remember that story about how after Paul gets, knocked off his horse and is blinded by the light and, hears the voice and has a conversation with Jesus, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he gets led into Damascus, and this guy, Ananias, prays for him, and he gets his sight back. I don't know if you remember this, but after all that happens, Paul goes off into the desert in Arabia for 3 years. That's called the big rethink, right? Because messiahs don't get crucified. They crucify the Romans. So how is it that this is the plan, right? Jesus has died, he's risen from the dead, so people's lives are being changed, but the world is kind of going on like it was. So how does this work? So somewhere in between the resurrection and Paul's first letters, the cross becomes the image of the thing that you conform to get in on the new life of wholeness as a human being that God has made you for. It takes a while, and I think it's Paul who has the first aha moment. It takes a while for them to see that death is actually the pattern for entering the new life. If Jesus had fought back, right? Pilate says, why don't your disciples fight? Jesus says, it's not that kind of kingdom. If Jesus had fought back, then all Jesus would have done is reinforce the precedent of dog eat dog, man kills man, I hurt you, you hurt me, I hurt you back, and somewhere in there, somebody has to die to that paradigm. And Jesus dies to the paradigm. It says, no. He puts a stake in the ground. It says, no. He tells the disciples, it will not be this way with you. From here on out, it's a whole different kind of deal. The expected Jesus was not going to die on a cross. You probably know these words, if I can find them. from Romans 6. Therefore, we were buried with him through baptism into death. The expected Jesus wasn't supposed to die. Now we're joining him in his death. We were buried with him through baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we should be able to walk in newness of life. It's not where anybody thought the story was going. And I wonder if in our lives this Advent, instead of just saying, because this is the default, oh yeah, Christmas, baby Jesus, Bethlehem, yay. Instead of just doing that, I wonder if this Advent we might permit unexpected Jesus to come to us, or recognize afresh that he is unexpected Jesus. The Jesus who would show us something new, who would show us something more beautiful, and who would call us into it, who would call us away from some of the things we have thought, and away from some of the things we've valued or the things we've seen, and call us into some kind of new territory that wouldn't have been according to the paradigm we would have laid out. Because what you shouldn't do is think that you already know the story. And I don't just mean the Christmas story. I mean the story of where God is going to take you from here on out in your life. You might, if you're like me, you probably look out at the rest of your life and you think, well, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, we're going to do this. But I will promise you that the Lord wants to do some things in you and some things through you and take you some places and change your thinking and just that you don't see. That's unexpected. It's different from how you would paint the picture. So what you shouldn't do is think that you already know the story. Mary did not know the story. And she still said yes. This Advent, may Jesus ask you to go somewhere you have never gone. Maybe even someplace you've been unwilling to go. And may you say yes to it. May it be to me, Lord, just as you have said. Father, I feel inspired this morning by the example of our sister Mary. I feel inspired that she would, despite her fears, that she would be so courageous as to say yes to you and be part of a story that actually didn't unfold the way she'd always been told it would unfold. And despite its hardships, unfolded better, more profoundly, more transformingly for so many people. For us, if she had not said, yes, Lord, would we be here this morning, gathered in your love? And so, Lord, may we this Advent season recapture that same spirit that she had. To go with the unexpected. To be willing to go where you lead, even if the story takes twists and turns, or you call us to something that is hard and that we might not have seen coming. Because the truth is that you are always taking us into the good things and the glorious things. Always. I wonder what Mary would have thought, Father, if she could have read those words Paul would write later, that all things work together for the good, for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. I hope we remember that, Lord. That the things you're doing, even when you call us to the unexpected or the difficult thing, you are working all things for the great big, good, glorious picture. Bless your name.